Okay, well, welcome everyone on this, well, certainly in Reading, a very hot and sweaty evening. I hope you are all keeping well. Very, very excited tonight to welcome back Pete Wharmby, who is our speaker for our June monthly talk. Pete will be talking about making an autistic living. And for those of you who signed up to the November webinar, you all know that this is a rescheduling of that talk, because unfortunately we did have to reschedule that because of Pete's illness. So I hope, Pete, you're feeling well. Okay, so just a brief overview. So if you don't know much about the Centre for Autism Wellbeing Hub at the University of Reading, and this is your first time at one of our webinars, well, huge and special welcome to you. The Wellbeing Hub is essentially me, my colleague Fiona, who might be waving on screen now, our colleague... Our colleagues Emma Harris and Charlie Murphy. And our aim at the Wellbeing Hub is to build an inclusive community of autistic people and their allies, and to work together to support autistic young people to thrive and flourish. And these webinars are part of that inclusive community that we aim to build. In terms of finding out more about what we do, you can do that most easily by going to our website and indeed signing up for our monthly newsletter. Everything that we do is in our monthly newsletter, so do drop us a line if you want to be added to our mailing list. The monthly talks, when we have permission from the speaker, as we have tonight, then we publish the recording of the talk as soon as we can after the event. And if you want to have a look at any of the previous talks where we have had permission from the speaker, then you can do that on our YouTube channel. And also, everything that we do is largely funded through donations. So if you are interested in making a donation to the Wellbeing Hub, you can do so following this link. And I'm going to, as soon as I hand over to Pete, I'm going to put links to all of these in the chat. So don't feel like you have to write them down. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping. So Pete's going to talk for about 55 minutes or so. And then actually there's going to be 30 minutes rather than 20, as it says on the slide. So we're going to finish the talk at around 8, and then there'll be 30 minutes for questions at the end. If you'd like to pose a question to Pete, could you please put it in the Q&A? And then what I'll do is I'll gather as many of those questions as I can and try and group them into themes so that I can put as many of them to Pete as possible. But we typically get large audiences, especially for Pete's talks. So apologies in advance if we don't manage to answer your specific question, but we will do our best. You'll also notice that the software that we're using tonight doesn't have a chat feature, but you can use the Q&A to chat. So do feel free to just put your comments in there and continue the conversation outside of the talk. As I said, the talk will be recorded and a link will be sent as soon as possible, but usually within about a week or so. Just a quick plug before we go to Pete about our July talk. So that's going to be held on the 10th of July, same time, 7 to 8:30 p.m. via Teams. And we're delighted to have John Adams join us, delivering a talk called A Conversation with Sparrows, Tales of Autistic Experience, Trauma and Wellbeing, seen from within a personal creative narrative. And again, I'm going to put a link to register for that webinar in the chat. If you would like to suggest a theme or a speaker for a future webinar, we're really open to that. And we have a Padlet webpage where you can make a note of that. And again, I'll put a link to that in the chat as well. So if you'd like to make a suggestion, please do. But let's focus on this evening. We are delighted to welcome back Pete Wharmby to the Wellbeing Hub webinar series. We were just chatting before we went live, and we remembered that Pete was actually our very first speaker when we launched the Wellbeing Hub. So it's great to have him back. Pete is very well known, but if you are not aware of him and his work, he is an autistic speaker, writer, tutor and parent. And he aims to improve autism acceptance in society by sharing insights, experiences of autism to the widest possible audience. In terms of Pete's writing, he's the author of 2 fantastic best-selling books, Untypical, How the World Isn't Built for Autistic People and What We Should All Do About It, and also What I Want to Talk About, How Autistic Special Interests Shape a Life. He's also, given his background as a secondary school teacher, Pete was also a major contributor to an important academic title called Learning from Autistic Teachers, How to Be a Neurodiversity Inclusive School. Links to all of these titles and other ways in which you can access Pete's work is available on his website, petewharmby.com. I do urge you to go visit that. But no more further chat from me. I'm going to hand over to Pete. Thank you very much, Pete.
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to this very warm, very sweaty evening talk. It's a challenge for me, as it all. I mean, everything's a challenge for me, but this kind of thing is always a challenge for me because temperature, as anyone who's read my books or I don't know, even heard me speak before, I've probably banged on quite a lot about temperature being one of my real sensitivities. It's one of my major sensory bugbears, if you like. So yeah, when I saw the weather was going to be 30 plus degrees today, it was a real sinking feeling, but I've managed to hole up in my living room where things are a bit cooler. Cool in terms of temperature. It's not cool in terms of coolness at all, but it's nice and chilled, and I should be good for the rest of the evening. So yeah, apologies to those people that missed that were affected when I had to cancel last time. It is unfortunately fact of life for me. I'm a bit of a canceller. Unfortunately, I get ill often. I have a lot of chronic pain issues, and I think that's something that a lot of autistic people will probably relate to one way or the other. It's also kind of relevant to what we're talking about tonight, of course, because if you do have a chronic pain or a chronic health condition, the workplace can be an even more challenging setting, and managing to stay in work can be even more difficult. But I'm here now, so hopefully you've been able to come along, and if not, you're watching the recording, and that's great. I'm going to be talking until about 8 o'clock, and I'm going to be talking around this idea of making an autistic living. So when I was given this kind of focus, and when I kind of started developing what I was going to say here, it struck me that there's several different elements to it around the idea of autistic employment, but also making an autistic living. It couldn't help but make me feel like it was a slightly broader thing too, like making a living, making a life, making an autistic friendly, an autistic neuroaffirming life for yourself. So sometimes I am going to go a bit further beyond just getting and keeping a job and looking a bit more broadly at managing the whole of your kind of existence. That sounds ridiculously broad and ridiculously big, but I'm nothing if not ambitious, so we'll see how it goes. Ultimately, though, this is I believe this to be a tremendously important topic. Historically, of course, awareness and understanding around autism has been firmly fixated upon young people, which, I can't totally complain about. That is necessary, and we do need young autistic people to be looked after and to be cared for and to be treated with compassion and to be understood. But historically, autistic adults have received very little of the interest of the world. We still, it seems, have to remind people that autistic adults even exist. And as part of that, what we see even in 2025 is that the idea of autistic people having a job, going out to work, maybe struggling to keep a job or struggling to find a job, is something that isn't exactly at the top of the tree when it comes to public awareness, public interest, media interest, even academic interest. It's still a few rungs down, which is a shame because it's obviously massively important. All of those autistic children who ideally, of course, will be treated very well in school and have a really neuroaffirming time in school. I mean, spoiler, they probably won't, but theoretically they could because of the attention paid, will eventually become autistic adults, obviously. And then all of that support and all of that knowledge and all of that understanding is just ripped away from them, falls away under their feet. And suddenly they find themselves alone, trying to navigate the adult world where knowledge is more sparse. Having said that, things are improving. I spend a great deal of my life these days traveling to businesses and companies and organizations, usually to talk about autism in the workplace, usually to talk about reasonable adjustments, accommodations, that kind of thing, so that these employers can hopefully make their workplace a little bit more pleasant and more comfortable and more accessible to their autistic staff. I don't think that would have been a thing 15 years ago. I mean, it wasn't a thing really 15 years ago at all, but it is now. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom. There is hope. Things are improving, but it is still an underexplored area for many people. And there are a lot of autistic adults out there who I would imagine, if they're anything like me, would feel a little isolated, a little alone, a little scared, maybe have a very precarious job situation, etc., etc. So, full disclosure then, before I start, I am, as always, going to be talking about things primarily from my own perspective, my own experience as an autistic adult who was once an autistic child. I was, of course, late diagnosed. That does have a big impact on a person's autistic experience. Late diagnosis versus early diagnosis can lead to two very different experiences, I've found in my conversations with people. And I am, of course, now self-employed, and actually arguably in the best kind of employment situation I've really been in my adult life. So I am coming at this from a position of some privilege in that, you know, it's like, oh, you know, I get to do what I want to do a little bit more than I used to. I just wanted to flag that up because I didn't want to come across as, you know, nobody wants to be patronized by somebody who's, you know, who doesn't necessarily have to work every day, which is how things are for me now. I've managed to forge a situation where I work probably 3 or 4 days a week, and the rest of the time is spent writing or creating silly Instagram memes or videos or whatever social media stuff I tend to do. So I think that's important because that obviously does have an impact on my perspective here. I'm looking at this very much in a kind of looking back over my life, if that makes sense, at the times when things were more difficult. I was a secondary school teacher for 15 years, which, with retrospect, I don't think I would have said this at the time, but in retrospect, I think I can say that was by far the hardest job I ever had, and also the job that had the biggest impact on my mental health in a negative way. It was basically the job that is going to be behind many of my anecdotes and points and ideas tonight, because it was that job that, you know, I mean, long story short, it nearly killed me, I think. One way or another, it really nearly did. And for that reason, I want to really flag up, well, you know, why? Why did it really have such a detrimental effect on me? And what might we be able to do to, you know, if I had my time again, what could have been done differently to avoid those potentially tragic outcomes? But moving further back, you know, I had my parade of jobs in my early 20s, office manager, and I was a cook at KFC for a while when I was at university. That was a good job. Fast food is stressful, but I got to take a lot of chicken home, so I can't really complain. Supermarket work, that kind of thing, you know, I've had a variety. So that's going to be the background that I kind of come from here. But I mentioned earlier about this being a really serious issue, and I just want to start, as I often do, with a few facts and stats and details and things like that. It was one of the first things I found out, actually, after diagnosis. I was reading up about, you know, oh, I'm autistic, am I? So now I need to try and figure out what that means. And in reading up on that, I stumbled across data on employment. And this would have been in the late 2010s, 2017, 2018, that I was looking this stuff up. And I found that the employment statistics for autistic adults were shockingly bad, and they haven't really improved much since then. The recent stats that I've looked at have only 3 out of 10 autistic adults in work. So 30%, I think. Yeah, 30%, which is gigantically low. I think the rate of disabled people generally in work is around 5 out of 10, 50%. So the autistic population in work is actually statistically lower than the more general disabled population, which will, of course, include all kinds of different disabilities, chronic illnesses, and so on and so forth, which to me is actually one of the most standout statistics I think I've ever seen on the subject. Because what is going on there? What is it about being autistic that makes work in particular so difficult to access, so difficult to maintain, to retain throughout the lifespan? We know that autistic people also face the largest pay gap out of all disability groups, all disabled groups. Autistic people have the largest pay gap. Autistic graduates are twice as likely to be unemployed after just over a year as non-disabled graduates. And we're also most likely to be overqualified. I mean, basically, long story short, pretty much every work-based statistic you can think of has a negative outcome when it comes to autistic people. There's something very wrong. There's something really, really wrong there that's not working. And of course, I think it's probably safe to say that a lot of people, if you just went up to them in the street, randomly and asked them about this and said to them about this, or even if you went to government, MPs and people in positions of tremendous power, they would probably place the blame on us, on the autistic people. There would be, I think, it's fair to say this, based on my experience of how, for example, autistic children are usually blamed for their struggles at school. That is the norm, as much as it shouldn't be. It really is. So it would stand to reason that it would be the same in the world of adults. The blame will come on to us. It's our fault for not being resilient. It's our fault for not being able to cope or hack it or whatever, all the usual stuff. But as any autistic person knows, or anyone who works closely with autistic people know, it's far, far more complicated than that. And that actually, likelihood is that there's an awful lot that workplaces could be doing to improve these statistics. An awful lot. Being autistic is not, in my personal opinion, a huge strike against being able to work. Logically speaking, if I'm honest with you, if I look at the big picture of what an autistic person is, and I'm talking here about autism singular, without necessarily any co-occurring conditions, just to be really transparent. But if you just consider, an autistic person and the needs that they will have, I don't see anything within autism itself that means that work is impossible. I really don't. I would say that my migraines is by a country mile a bigger impact on my ability to earn money and make a living than my being autistic should be in a world that works properly. Because chronic pain, like as I mentioned earlier, where you can barely function when you're in so much pain and the medication doesn't work and you're being banded between doctors. Yeah, I can see how that could be very difficult to overcome. Very, very difficult to manage the workplace in that regard. But autism, I mean, yeah, sure, sensory sensitivity, yeah, that is a thing, but it can be remedied. It can be accommodated for. It can be managed if people know about it and care about it. Communication and social differences, social anxiety, that kind of thing. Again, yeah, it can be a barrier, but I don't see it being unassailable. Things like executive function differences and stress levels and the fear of meltdown and these kind of things. These are all things in my perception, at least, I could be wrong, but in my perception, should come nowhere near close to bringing the shutters down on the possibility of work. They need some management, and like many disabilities, they need support and need various bits and bobs, but they shouldn't be a complete block against being able to stay in gainful employment, and a job that suits you and is good for you and that allows you to live your independent life. And we see this because we see that the disabled rate of employment is 5 out of 10. I mean, I would argue that's not high enough anyway, but 5 out of 10 is higher than 3 out of 10. So whatever the more the wider disabled population is able to be given accommodation wise is clearly helping, because their rate is higher than just the autistic person's rate. So yeah, there's something going on there. And what I want to do today is figure out why this is and try to give some advice as to how we can try and get around this on an individual level. Obviously, I would like things to change at a macro level. I spend a lot of my time trying to get things to change at a macro level, but realistically, sometimes what we really need to do is get down into the nitty-gritty and try and figure out, well, what can we all individually do now? You know, before great systemic change happens, what can we do now to get through now, the tricky times now? So that's what I'm going to be hopefully trying to address. So we have autistic people really struggling to access work. Now, in terms of why this is, I could talk for hours on this. I do talk for hours on this. If you don't know much about autism, then I recommend heavily, obviously, go out there and find out, you know, how autism presents, how it works, what it is. But usually I tend to break it down into those topics that I've already mentioned: sensory differences, communication differences, social differences, differences in how we pay attention and focus on things, and differences in stress levels generally. Those are the reasons. I think the reason why autistic people aren't in work is because of those things. Okay, we are sensorially overwhelmed because the workplace is not in any way calibrated to autistic sensory needs. It's calibrated to non-autistic sensory needs, but it's not calibrated to people whose sensory needs are a little bit different. Hence, we get stressed, we get overwhelmed, we get burned out, we have meltdowns, we quit, we're fired, whatever. Same with social communication. We talk differently, we communicate differently, we have a different communicative culture. Anything from not making eye contact to speaking in longer sentences, longer utterances, all of these can have us feel alienated at work. They can contribute to that feeling of, I can't do this, or indeed contribute to being pushed out the door because you're different. Being monotropic, having that singular focus can be great, sure. You know, it can be a reason why we're actually very employable, because we can fixate on a topic and get it done at tremendous speed and with tremendous proficiency, perhaps. But it can be difficult to get us to shift our focus onto something new. Hence, we might get fired, or we might get warnings, or we might not be able to fit into a workplace. There's all these things that happen. All of these differences, they all bubble away there constantly, every single day of a working autistic person's life. Sometimes you get through a day without things being too bad. Sometimes a day is an absolute catastrophe. Sometimes those catastrophic days are truly catastrophic. Something goes really wrong and you find yourself out of work. Sometimes you gradually feel that you can no longer work because you're expending so much energy on just trying to survive, by trying to mask your sensory discomfort, by trying to mask your general autisticness. And it wears you out, you're exhausted, you burn out, you're on long-term sick, and then before you know it, you haven't got a job anymore. There's a million reasons why an autistic person would lose their job. There's another million reasons why an autistic person would leave their job. But I would argue that all of them, well, no, not all of them, many of them, if not most of them, are potentially resolvable, given knowledge, understanding on the part of both the employee and the employer, patience, compassion, empathy, all the usual stuff. What we need, what the autistic population needs, is for workplaces to understand autism generally, to have a much better base level of understanding of what autism is, ideally of what neurodivergence is more broadly, you know, so they can deal with other neurodivergences, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, mental health difficulties, etc., etc. But we also need to work on ourselves, and I say that with great care. I am not going to sit here and tell anyone that they need to do more and pull their socks up. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is that there are some things that we can do for ourselves which might help us manage work better. So we can ask, basically, what I'm trying to do is break this down into two halves. We can ask employers to do their bit, and that is probably the bigger bit, but we can also do things for ourselves. I think it's important to feel a sense of agency anyway. We don't want to feel like it's all down to the bosses, because that makes us powerless, and that's very, very upsetting. There are things that we can do for ourselves that might help manage the workplace. So, making an autistic living, being able to find a job, and even more crucially, keep a job. What do we need to do? Well, let's focus first of all on the things. I'm just trying to work out which way around to do this. I think I'm going to start with employers. I'm going to start with what employers need to do. Now, if you yourself are an employer, then obviously listen to this with, hopefully with interest. These are things that you might be able to do immediately for your autistic staff. If you are not an employer, if you are simply a normal person, trying to get through life, then bear all of this stuff in mind. These are the things that you can ask for. These are the things that you might want to go into work either tomorrow or at some point in the future when you finally, have work or whatever it might be. These are the things that you might want to ask for, talk about, get out there, try and get set up, etc., etc. So, employers. First of all, employers need to have, as I mentioned, a better understanding of autism. It is not enough for any workplace, and I say this really quite strongly, to just bumble through neurodiversity. Just kind of try and figure it out as they go along. That is not going to work. All employers, in my personal opinion, and this is only my opinion, I don't think there's any necessary law about this yet, but they all need to have had some form of training or awareness raising or access to information that means that they are at least broadly conversant on the details of what autism is. That should be a bare minimum, in my opinion. And I would suggest that anyone that works for an employer should gently push for that. Really make, just kind of really aim to get employers and workplaces to really take this seriously. The number of neurodivergent people generally and the number of autistic people in the workplace is not going to go down. That's never going to happen. As far as we know, the rate of autism is probably relatively constant. It's not shooting up like some people think. It's not like people are actually more autistic now than they used to be. It's just more people are aware of it. And that number will continue to grow as more and more people become aware of autism and realize that they themselves are autistic. I think it's fair to say that at least over the next 10, 20 years, we're going to just see a very steady rise in the rate of autistic people. That is the number of autistic people per 100. I think it's going to just continue to rise and rise until it will presumably eventually plateau at around whatever the actual incidence of autism actually is, which we don't know. We do not know what that number is. I don't think anyone has any real idea. All we know is what the current diagnosis rate is. So what we're going to see over the next couple of decades is that number going up and up and up. And that is, of course, going to affect workplaces. Every workplace, as they are already discovering, hence why I have to go to these places to talk to them, every workplace is going to be confronted with the fact that they have got autistic employees. And these autistic employees are increasingly knowledgeable about their own autism and will therefore have expectations and will want to have accommodations, reasonable adjustments, etc., etc. And none of that will happen if employers and organizations, companies have no understanding of what autism actually is. And the reason this has to be an active process is because currently, at least, we're not taught this stuff in schools. We don't leave school with a basic understanding, all of us, with what autism is. We do leave school with, or we do kind of grow into adults with a basic understanding of what, I think you could argue we leave school with a basic understanding of what gender is, various minorities, ethnic groups, that kind of thing. We don't leave school with any understanding about neurodiversity at all, apart from maybe we had to sit next to a kid in English who we didn't really understand and we were kind of scared of them because we didn't understand them. What we're dealing with here is this massive, potentially gigantic accessibility and minority access issue, which has like so little foundational knowledge to build on that it's just unfathomable. Autistic people are going into workplaces to be met by bosses, team leaders, managers who know absolutely zero about autism. That's actually quite an interesting situation that we've found ourselves in, I think. So one thing that employers have to do is really prioritize upskilling themselves, getting that level of knowledge up there. If you are a manager, if you are an employer, you have to figure this stuff out. You have to read up on it. You have to, I don't know, watch YouTube videos. The thing is, the information's out there and it's not like centralized or anything. This isn't the kind of thing where you have to get governmental training. I mean, one day maybe there will be a government training program. I mean, that would be nice in education at least, but there's no sign of it currently. But it doesn't matter because you're spoiled for choice, really, in getting that information, the number of ways you can get that information. It's out there. Autistic people are desperately trying to tell you this stuff. So just open up and listen. So we need to up the rate of knowledge. Employers have to take very seriously the kind of adjustments that they will therefore have to make for autistic people. If you're an employer, you have to think very seriously about, for example, sensory audits of your workplaces, of your offices, your shop fronts, your factory floors, whatever it happens to be. You've got to start taking very seriously the idea that the sensory environment is not suitable for a lot of people, a significant minority of people. And it can be difficult, I think, for employers to kind of figure that out and to recognize that. But what they have to realize is that, as I said earlier, it's about calibration. The workplace as is calibrated to neurotypical sensory needs, very roughly, very, very broadly. Hence why we have certain things like temperature limitations, how hot or how cold it's allowed to get before we no longer have to work or no longer can work. Things like that, things like light levels in buildings and sound levels in buildings, and when do you have to wear ear defenders? All of this stuff exists. Non-autistic people have loads of sensory accommodations made for them. I mean, hell, radiators and air conditioners are sensory accommodations. Really, they are. Autistic people simply need ours to be a little bit different, maybe a bit stronger, maybe not quite as strong, depending. We need more flexibility. We need our sensory needs to be met, whether that includes us being allowed to wear different clothing, being allowed to wear ear defenders or earbuds, being allowed to work in a different part of the building where the light is less harsh or where the light is more harsh, because, we're all different in the world of autism, in terms of sensory needs, but there needs to be a real openness to flexibility amongst employers to allow for that. Few other things that I want to say to employers, that they need to provide once they've got this knowledge, once they've got this understanding, because, they've read up on it or they've done some courses or they've had a speaker in or whatever. You need to really reevaluate your communication processes. You need to really think very carefully about how you communicate things, how you communicate individually to people, how you utilize things like sarcasm, irony, workplace banter, which I think is probably one of the root causes of many autistic people's unhappiness at work. Understanding the fact that you are sharing the office with people whose communicative culture is very different to yours. This is something that I don't think many people really recognize. Increasingly these days, I talk about autistic communication as very much a different culture. Almost like, you've got people from another country in your office or in your workplace who just have a different set of rules, a different set of how to communicate. And to treat it as such, and to treat it with that kind of respect that you would hopefully treat to guests from another country, working in your setting. Or if you traveled to them, on some kind of work trip or something like that, or you were working with foreign clients or something like that, and you were working with somebody from a different culture, you would hopefully, I would expect, treat that culture with great respect, attempt to meet it halfway, not be too offended if they did something that isn't necessarily in our culture but is in theirs. Include autism in this. I would say. You know, like, it's difficult to talk about this without getting kind of mildly xenophobic, or at least sounding mildly xenophobic, because it's all generalizations. But like, when you work with certain people from certain nationalities and certain cultural backgrounds, there'll be differences in things like volume of voice, in how much they might talk, in how much gesture they will utilize, in how much eye contact they will make, in how often they will swear, in how often they will use humor. I mean, the British, for example, are famous worldwide, as far as I can see, for being very difficult to make us act seriously. You know, we treat everything like a joke. And from what I've read, it really irritates businessmen in other parts of the world. You know, it really bothers them that it's very difficult to get British people to take things seriously. But add autistic to that cultural kind of knowledge that you have in your head. Yeah, there are people in your office who won't make eye contact. It's a cultural thing. Yeah, there are people in your office who will, if given the chance, talk to you at length about their favorite hobbies. It's a cultural thing. It's just what we do. Yes, there are people in your office who might get very anxious around sarcasm, not because we don't understand it, that's a bit of a myth, but simply because we don't know really, is that what's being employed right now, or is it not? I don't know. And is it being directed at me? I don't know. That's a cultural thing. So be respectful. Try and meet us halfway on that. It's not actually very hard, I don't think, for employers to do some of these things. It certainly doesn't cost a huge amount of money. Most of it is simply just awareness, really, and just being on the ball, remembering to do these things, and to just change your own kind of mental calibration about how people actually work and what people actually do. In terms of their communication, in terms of their sensory world, in terms of their paying attention, that kind of thing. But it's very doable, so long as the will is there, the energy is there, and there's a real consistent effort for it. And what I think you can find, and what I've seen happen in certain workplaces where I've gone in and worked with them and they've made some changes, is autistic people's stress levels, autistic people's anxiety levels start to drop. Not necessarily in a way that can be measured, you know, it's still early days in terms of researching this kind of thing, but stress levels start to decline. Levels of discontent, levels of massive anxiety, I mean, maybe even levels of depression and other mental health difficulties can start to drop. People can feel safer. I think safer is a crucial part of this in workplaces that, as I started with, know about autism. Because I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, you will know this if you're autistic yourselves. There's nothing more exhausting, is there, than having to educate your own boss. Being in the position where you're forced to basically explain everything to them because they don't know any of it. You know, you're already struggling. You might already be in like a capability procedure, but you're having to explain what being autistic means to them. I mean, I speak from experience, that very specific situation. It's a horrible experience because I don't know about you, but I just spend the whole time thinking, they don't believe me. They just think I'm making excuses. You know, am I really getting through to them? I mean, I had a horrible moment recently with a school where I mentioned alexithymia as being a really key, crucial aspect of what they needed to remember for their kids. You know, alexithymia, the idea that autistic people sometimes might not know what their emotional state is. They can struggle with identifying emotional state and talking about what's caused their emotional state. And they looked at me blankly. They'd never even heard of it. They didn't even know it existed. And I was like, I mean, you know, in some ways, okay, great, here I am and I can explain it to you. And hopefully I can explain it to you fairly well and you'll learn something. But I couldn't shake the feeling of, if they've never heard this before, and then this random person's trying to tell them about it, are they really going to listen? Are they really going to take away what I'm saying to them? Because in that spur of the moment, people get defensive, people get stressed themselves, and, you know, information doesn't always land. So yeah, a bit of a tangent there, but yes, there's nothing more stressful than feeling that you have to explain all of this in one of those already very stressful moments, you know. So we need to make sure, employers, you need to do the homework yourselves. You need to upskill and you need to know this stuff so that when we come to you with our needs, or something that we just need to get off our chest, or we need a little accommodation or a little adjustment. Don't like those terms, but it's all we've got at the moment. That you can just kind of go, oh, yeah, I know about this. Cool, yeah, no, yeah, of course, yeah, we can do something about this. I mean, my God, how much nicer that would be than to have to explain it from scratch. We need you to take the sensory thing seriously, recognize that calibration needs to be broadened, more flexibility, and we need you to accept this autistic culture into your workplaces, accept our way of being into your world, into your lives, and recognize we're not trying to annoy you, we're not rude, we're not really even blunt. We just have a different way of doing all this stuff. So, treat it with respect. There are a million other things that employers could and should do. That goes without saying, but I'm going to stick to those basic tenets for the purposes of tonight, because I do want to move on to what is probably the more important topic. My mouth is dry. It's a hot, hot day today. I want to talk about what we can do for ourselves. If you are an autistic individual at any point in your career, maybe even just a student, and just a student, what horrible phrasing. I didn't mean it like that. I meant like, you're not in the workplace yet because you are a student currently. Sorry about that. But if you're a student and you're looking forward to work, whatever situation you're in, what can you do? What can you do off your own back, with your own energy, where you don't have to necessarily rely on other people? Well, I've got a few ideas about this, a fair few. So, number one of the most important things every autistic person needs, and this is going to sound a bit flaky, but do stick with me, is self-knowledge. When I was diagnosed as autistic, I was given a pamphlet or two, photocopied, and a reading list of books that all came out in the 90s. I don't know why, but that's what I was given. And off I went. I wasn't sat down, and I didn't have it explained to me at all. No one sat down with me. I know that some people actually get offered therapy, and I think that's a good thing, but I wasn't. I didn't have it explained to me one bit. I didn't have anyone kind of sit me down and say, okay, so now you're autistic. Here's what that means. I didn't myself learn about, for example, really key things like rejection sensitivity or alexithymia or interoception differences. When I said alexithymia, Alexa woke up. So there we are. Thanks, Amazon, for that. That was strange. Anyway, I didn't know about any of those things back in 2017. And crucially, I had to learn them myself. Nobody told me about them. If you've been diagnosed at any point in your life, whether it's a late diagnosis or an early one, you really need to do some self-reflection about how much about your autistic self do you really know? Do you know your sensory profile, if you like? Like, have you really sat down and figured out what you need on a sensory level? I asked that very seriously because I didn't figure it out for a couple of years, and I'm even now still tweaking it. Like I used to say for a long time that sound was by far my biggest sensitivity. I think I went on record in untypical saying that, if I'm honest with you. But since then, I've realized that no, it is definitely temperature. Without any shadow of a doubt, temperature is all for me. It's everything. And I'm better off with that knowledge. Knowing that, I can make better decisions. I can make better use of my time, make better use of my income, to buy fans and, big bottles of water and stuff. I having discerned that information, I'm better equipped. So if you haven't really sat down and truly given that some thought, maybe that's the thing to start with. And it's not just your sensory experience, it's everything really. You don't necessarily have to write it all down, but it's probably not a bad idea to, if I'm honest, like a second CV, just another document, a bit like Dwight in The Office when he hands in his CV, the American Office, when he hands in his CV, but also his karate skills. to would-be employers. Treat it a bit like that. You've got your CV, which is great, but you've also got, maybe more for your own use, your autisticness profile. You might want to share it with your employer later on down the line, but you've got it. You know what you are. You know who you are. Again, are you alexithymic? How would you know? Do you have rejection sensitivity? Do you think you do? Are you prone to dealing with rejection very, very, in a really overwhelmed and anxious way? Have you got what might be described as a PDA profile? Are you strongly monotropic? Are you, a capable masker? How much energy does masking spend for you? Can you do it for a long time, or can you only do it for short amounts of time? These are all things that you will be able to figure out about yourself, but that you won't necessarily instinctively know, especially for the late diagnosed who have spent the majority of their lives assuming they're neurotypical and who will have very much based their lives around the assumption that they are neurotypical. Like, I spent the majority of my life socializing in what I would call a very neurotypical way and wondering why I was constantly so overwhelmed and depressed and miserable. Now I socialize in a far more autistic friendly way, or certainly far more autistic as far as I'm concerned kind of way. And I have a much more manageable life as a result of that. I usually make the joke that I don't socialize at all, but that's the thing. That's not true. I do sometimes, and that's perfect for me. Sometimes I do it very little, but when I do, it's nice and it's fun and it's good. So spend some real quality time getting to know yourself. And I think every autistic person can start doing this immediately if you haven't done it already. And like I say, your sensory needs, they're paramount. They're something you really need to know. But also those other things. Do you have, are you alexithymic? Do you have difficulty with interoception? Do you know when you're hungry? Do you know when you're thirsty? Do you know when you need the toilet? Are you socially anxious, or actually is there something else going on there? Etc., etc., etc. I'm actually thinking of putting together a in the middle of all the other writing I've got to do, in putting together a kind of checklist or something on my website that you'll be able to print off. I will try and remember to get that done over the next few weeks, just to give people it's nice to have a scaffold, isn't it? It's nice to have a framework to base it all on. I know there are others out there, though. There are so many content creators that make this stuff. See if you can find one online. Anyway, other things that employees can do for themselves. I can't believe it's nearly 10 to already. Honestly, time. I don't like time. That's another thing I've learned about myself. I really do not like time. I don't really know what to do about that, but it's a fact. Anyway, routines. Now, this is one of those that comes with a giant proviso, because routines aren't a cure-all. They're not a magic bullet that always helps all autistic people. The presence of ADHD, for example, can throw all of this into disorder, for example, into chaos, But having said that, routine can be a lifesaver for a lot of autistic people. And it's worth bearing in mind that in terms of work, certainly for me, I think when I was working, every job that I had in whatever capacity, wherever it was that I worked, I always ended up with an incredibly strong, really quite rigid, yes, quite rigid routine, certainly a morning routine, but I followed absolutely religiously. And I genuinely think that's why I managed to cope in those jobs for as long as I did, because I defended my routine to the hilt. I really did. I was very, very strong on that. I did not let things interrupt or get in the way of my routine. It's one of the reasons why parenthood was so difficult for me. Suddenly becoming a dad, my routine went out the window, and I struggled to rebuild a new one, and that really was difficult for me. But if you haven't built routines, it's worth trying it out. I mean, that might sound like a bit of a silly thing to say. I mean, what autistic people haven't? But, if you are, like me, autistic ADHD, it might be that it's just never quite clicked for you, in which case maybe it's worth time for another try. Try and get a really tight routine going that helps. The reason we need routine, remember, isn't because we're autistic and autistic people just like routine. That's oversimplified. It's because we're so stressed. by everything. And when you're really stressed, that's when you need routine. It's like autopilot. It removes some of the need to think, to be quite honest. It removes a need to be fully present, which allows you just to lower your stress levels considerably. You know, my morning routine, so long as it runs smoothly, I can more or less just switch off, you know, and just go through the motions. And, you know, it doesn't expend too much of my mental energy. Basically, I'm not overthinking everything. You know, I'm not overthinking timings. I'm not overthinking breakfast. I'm not overthinking anything because it's all tried and tested. So that desperate desire to overthink, which is a huge part of my life, is never activated, which is so nice, so soothing to have that genuine autopilot. Okay, so that's something to consider. Another thing to consider is strong advocacy, both for yourself and others in the workplace. And this is built very much on knowledge, your own knowledge. The more knowledge you have about autism, the stronger your advocacy will be because you'll be confident in it. It's hard to advocate for something that you don't really know that much about or that you don't really understand. You know, that's quite difficult. You'll be very easily come unstuck, or you'll be very easily led down a dark alley by, you know, people who are arguing against you. You know, you can't argue back because you don't really know. So once you've got a good understanding of your own autism and you know about autism generally, try and take on a bit of an advocacy role. And another part of this is to maybe either start or join, if one already exists, a group within the workplace. Some bigger organizations have these now. Most of them seem to, the biggest organizations seem to. Large organizations and companies have long had disability groups within them. You know, disabled employees that kind of come together and, you know, work together for advocacy reasons and to put on events and to, you know, meet and sort things out as a kind of collective, you know, almost like a union, like I mean, don't use that word because it doesn't always go down very well, but it's the same idea, a collectivism. And very often there are now neurodivergent collectives within organizations. And if there isn't one, then start one. You know, why not? Why not be that instigator? And what that means is once you've got that established, well, there's comfort in numbers. There's strength in numbers too, of course. If you've got a collective of, say, 10, 15, 20 neurodivergent people all working together, not only to put on events and to make a big deal out of Autism Awareness Week and to, you know, celebrate Neurodiversity Pride Day and all that kind of stuff, which is great and really needed, but as well as that, the actual you know, deep work of advocacy can begin in earnest, of pushing for things, pushing for change, having a seat in meetings, having a position in the echelons of the company or the organization so that decisions can be made with knowledge about neurodiversity factored in. That can be enormously powerful. And every organization can have something equivalent to this. I mean, goodness, even schools, in my experience, are starting to develop these for the students. You know, like neurodiversity clubs and things like that. Universities often have them too, of course. And like I say, private companies really do. They're really embracing this. So as I say, join or create that, and that can be a real force for change. All of these things can make retention more possible. The ability to just stay in the workplace, to be able to stay in the job, to not burn out, to not have to just quit because you can't take it anymore. All of this is designed to try to alleviate that. There are issues, of course, around recruitment. That's a whole other story. Interview processes generally are not autistic friendly in the slightest. In fact, I think there's an argument that typical standard traditional interviews are pretty much the most autistic hostile things that have ever been invented, apart from airports and secondary schools. But know your worth with those things. If you are thinking about, you know, recruitment, if you're looking for work or you've got interviews coming up, increasingly employers do know about this stuff. So it's worth pushing for what you deserve as an autistic person in an interview. You know, asking for questions beforehand, asking for a guided tour the day or the week before the interview, or just a virtual tour. asking what their neurodiversity groups are like. You know, do they have any of this stuff? Are they neuroaffirming? Is this part of their workplace culture? Asking for, my mind's gone blank about the interview thing. I'll come back to him. I'm sure people ask a question. Yeah, alongside the asking for questions in advance, also asking for the kind of scheduling. People often forget this. Asking for the schedule in advance. What's the actual day going to look like? Some places are great and they'll send that stuff out anyway. Other places like, for some reason, to make it a mystery. That's okay, great, but it really puts neurodivergent people, autistic people in particular, in a tricky spot. And then, of course, we've got the concept, and I don't want to go over my time, but I do want to mention it briefly. You've got the idea of self-employment. Yeah. Most autistic people I know, obviously because most of the autistic people I know are these days are authors or people that work in creative stuff, are self-employed. Self-employment is in many ways a bit of a gift for autistic people of a certain disposition. Not having a boss, for example, not necessarily having too much in the way of colleague socializing, certainly works for me very well, because the majority of my difficulty, I suppose, is around social communication. That is really is my biggest issue. It's something I really struggle with. Combined with rejection sensitivity, makes working with others very tricky for me. So being self-employed works really well for me for that. It comes with its challenges, of course. The scariest thing, of course, is the financial. I'm living through that a little bit at the moment. You go through dry spells where the work isn't coming in as much as it was, and you start to kind of panic a little bit. But things often come back. But at least everything is in your hands. I've really enjoyed the feeling of, I need to push a bit now. I need to do I need to write some LinkedIn stuff. I've got to try and get my name out there again, get some people getting in touch, do a bit of hard selling. I don't like doing it, but I like the fact that that's it, the ball's in my court, if that makes sense. I like having people often say that autism is very tightly linked with autonomy. I mean, AUT, but a real strong drive for independence it seems to be a really big thing for so many of us. And that's the aspect I love about being self-employed. I'm, the master of my own destiny. If I fail, I fail, and it's my doing. I'm not just going to get fired for not making eye contact. I'm pushing myself, and I'm trying to sort things out myself. It's difficult, of course, because first of all, what are you self-employed doing? That's a big question. But very often, of course, special interests can be such a potential way in there. I've got to be careful here, because I'm not saying for a moment that everyone can make a living off their special interest, because I don't think that would be sincere, because it is difficult. It's a challenging world out there to get noticed and to get your stuff out there. But I know enough people who create, paint, sculpt, construct, build, write, take photos, all that stuff, who are autistic, who do it off their own back, and who are making a living. And for them, yeah, it's their special interest. It's the thing that they get their hyperfixations on. And I don't think that should be overlooked. That monotropic ability to really hone in on something and focus on it, often at the expense of all else, can be a powerful tool if you want to make a living for yourself. With a bit of, a bit of luck and a bit of social networking, which can be quite tricky. But I think it's something that it's something I would say all autistic people should consider. Spend a little bit of time, spend an evening thinking about, not necessarily acting on it, but just thinking, if push came to shove, or if I really could, or if the stars aligned, what could I do? What would my angle be? And don't be put off by the enormity of it. I would say it is scary, and the financial aspect is worrying, and it can be difficult to get the ball rolling. And just, I mean, even thinking about tax, and I look back on those days as a teacher when all my tax was done for me, by pay as you earn. I look back on that so fondly. That was so nice, because the actual real world of tax is just bloody horrible. But it's doable. It is doable. It's not fun, but it's doable. It's manageable. So yeah, I just wanted to end really before we go on to Q&A. Don't feel like the only option is ever going to be, working for another, and having to get them to understand autism and having to get them to provide you reasonable accommodations. There is that other way, and it's difficult and it's tricky and it takes, a bit of luck and, graft and all that kind of thing. But it is there. It does exist. It's not like becoming a football player or becoming a rock star, like just unattainable nonsense. It's very real. I know a lot of self-employed autistic people. It's really possible. And I think it can be nice just to feel like you've got that potential safety net or escape route, or whatever you want to kind of word it as. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud more by this point than anything. The heat is starting to get to me. But I had to turn the air conditioning off, you see, because it was too noisy. You wouldn't be able to hear me. It's so loud. So yes, it's getting really hot in here. So I'm going to finish there, I think. I'm just going to sum up very briefly. If you're an employer, take it all very seriously. This isn't going away. Get your knowledge up there and take steps to make the workplace more adaptive, more flexible, and more accepting of difference. If you're an employee, then get your own knowledge of yourself up to the right level, so that you really know who you are and you know what to ask for, how to advocate for yourself. Set up some routines, get some strong advocacy going, maybe with a group in the workplace, and never totally overlook that idea of self-employment. There we are. Thank you. Oh, I can't hear you, Joe. Sorry.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you so much. As ever, excellent talk. And yeah, I'm always in awe of your ability to talk so comprehensively without slides or aids of any kind. It's so super impressive. Thank you so much. Yeah, we have lots of questions for you. Really active chat this evening. So thank you to everyone who's posted a question or made a comment. I'll do my very best to get through them. I'm going to group some together because some similar themes are coming up. The first of which is, how do we, first of all, get employers to care about neurodivergent employees or kind of neurodiversity, creating kind of environments that are suitable for all minds and all ways of being? So how do we first make employers care about that? And then B, how do we then get them to make meaningful change rather than kind of paying lip service through things like, the inviting some speakers but not actually making any difference, or signing up to the disability confidence scheme but not actually making a meaningful difference? What do you think?
Yeah, well, for the first one, unfortunately, certainly with private companies, anything that, well, really anything, because even charities have got their bottom line on the. They've got to think about that, haven't they? You've got to, unfortunately, appeal to money. You have to, because the world is a dreadful, dreadful place. To be quite honest with you, that's the bottom line, really. That's what you have to do. In order to get them to listen, first of all, you use the point that I made earlier, that this isn't going away. It's not a flash in the pan. It's not one of those things that's, oh, if we just ignore it, it'll go away. It really won't. But secondly, retainment. It's a big deal for us as employees. Sure, we want to stay in our job. Of course we do. But don't underestimate how big a thing it is for them. Rehiring, replacing you, costs a fortune. Getting people up to the level of knowledge, for example, and experience that you have, because you've worked there for X number of years, is really expensive and time consuming and, quite frankly, boring and awful. Most employers would avoid it if they could, unless they have a really good reason to, fire somebody, for gross misconduct or something. It is something that most employers would really rather not have to worry about. the churn and retention rates are a big deal for many companies. They really have to address it. And this is one way that you can encourage them to do that. Because a non-neuro-affirming workplace, I think, is going to have bigger problems with retention than one that understands autistic people. Just by definition. If you can't understand and therefore can't help your autistic staff, they will end up leaving before they naturally otherwise would. And therefore you appeal to their wallets, you appeal to the bottom line, and you say, look, do this properly and you will see an improvement. I hate even talking about it because it just feels I'm not a capitalist. I don't like any of it. It makes me feel very grubby, but that is the reality. That's the grim reality of where we are. So I would say just wholeheartedly go for that. In terms of the second point, I mean, goodness me, yeah, I have the same problem with schools. I go in and we talk and, I give them some information and get them to see things from a different point of view. And then I leave and all I'm thinking on the drive home is, did any of that stick? Did it? And I can do my things. I'll send follow-up emails and stuff like that, see how they're getting on, kind of hold their feet to the fire a little bit in that cheeky way. But that's okay for me because I'm the person that comes in to do the speaking. For employees in the space, you have to just hold them accountable, I think. You just have to keep the pressure on. And I don't mean like you've got to do anything necessarily big or scary. It's just, let's imagine that there has been a talk or there has been training. Well, refer to it. When next time you need to make a reasonable adjustment request, refer to the training. Refer to when that person came in to talk, when whoever it was came in that day and they talked about all this, didn't they? Yeah. And now I need that right now, actually. Just, remind them constantly. If you make yourself, a neurodiversity group within your workplace, send out a weekly email. I mean, it sounds so weak, doesn't it? But it is these little things that really do help things stick. They just help make things feel part of the furniture, which is kind of what you want. You want things to feel like a natural part of the workplace. You don't want them to feel like an add-on. You want them to feel integral. So send out a weekly newsletter with articles that you found, a few social media bits and bobs, maybe a video that somebody's made, and you just keep the conversation going as much as you've got the energy to. And of course, there is a problem here in that often what we end up asking for here is for those people that need to reserve their energy the most to have to give it away on doing this stuff. And that is a problem.
That's actually something that is the next kind of theme, is that it's this kind of burden of responsibility on the autistic person. So that's the responsibility to disclose for a start. Yes. And then also the responsibility to, first of all, ask for adjustments. And then also, like you're saying, to hold people to account and so forth. And some people in the chat have been saying that, absolutely understandably, that there's not only just the fatigue that might come with that, which you did talk about in your talk, just the burden of that on an individual, but also the real fear that by asking for those things and pushing for those things, that would then make you a target, or at least make you kind of less desirable, and potentially kind of might lead to you being kind of moved out of an organisation. Even though we understand that that's not a lawful process, we have to acknowledge that those things still do happen. So what advice would you have? Because I think there's no one here who would argue with the need for that need for self-advocacy, but how would you recommend that be done while also kind of protecting oneself and looking after oneself?
Yeah, it's a good question. In many ways, we live in the difficult time for this. We're not yet at the position where employers just know this stuff anyway. That will probably happen, but it's not there yet. So we're unfortunately living through that time period where we have to be the ones to push for that. And it's, that is difficult. I would say that in order to simultaneously push for change, but also protect yourself, that's where the unionization analogy comes in. The working as a group. working together with others. It's one thing to be an individual pushing for change, but they can be so easily dismissed. And I mean that in both cases of the word, dismissed as just kind of like, oh, shush, I don't care, or actually, fired or sent away. Whereas if you're part of a group, even if it's just two of you, it's better than one, because you've got that strength of numbers, you've got backup, you've got sharing of energy, people, it's not all on the onus isn't all on you. So we're once again back to that idea of forming wherever possible, and of course I appreciate it's not always possible, but wherever possible, forming a either formal or informal neurodiversity group, and do make it neurodiversity. I can't say that word tonight. Because first of all, you might struggle to find, depending on the size of your workplace, it might not be possible to find another autistic person. It's fairly likely, but it's not guaranteed. Whereas if you broaden it out to neurodiversity, you've got a far greater chance, and also it increases the representation, doesn't it? You don't want it to all be about autism. There are other things out there. ADHD.
And also neurodiversity is about all of us, right? So that would also include people who are, who might conform to that majority. And that, I'm just wondering if that's where, I wonder what your thoughts are, Pete, on allies. Somebody who, I myself perhaps conform quite more closely to a majority neurotype, and I work hard to be a good ally. It means a lot to me that I work hard at that, and I don't always get it right, but I'm willing to learn and so on. I mean, how important do you think it might be? Because we've had a question here about what advice do you have for someone who wants to set up a group like that within an organisation? And I'm really interested, is there a need for that to be a kind of closed group where people who are neurodivergent have lived experience of that, have a safe place to talk about that? Or is it important that it is more universally open and allies are invited in?
I think it will depend very heavily on the culture of the workplace. Some cultures will lend themselves to being far more open, and the best results will be gained from a working group that is totally open, totally inviting all, neurotypical people are welcome too. Let's build some allyships, that kind of thing. But I think it's important to say that there are going to be some workplaces where, certainly to begin with, perhaps it will be safer to keep things, we want this to be neurodivergent people only, because we need to, maybe just to begin with, we need to set some ground rules, and we want to, we need to set some, get some policy ideas going, we want to feel safe. We don't want to feel like we're being judged or watched as we do this kind of thing. That will depend so heavily on the environment. But I think that the point about allies is really important. Don't overlook them. And my goodness, don't throw them out. Don't throw babies out with the bathwater. If there is somebody who wants to be a really good ally and they get the terminology wrong once, don't kick them out. Don't lose trust or faith in them, because, you see it online a lot. I don't think it happens quite so much in the real world, but online it happens a lot, where somebody will come in and they want to be an ally, and then they say, oh, are you on the spectrum? And then everything goes horribly wrong, and everyone's like, we don't like that term. Maybe try to avoid that, because you do want allies. I mean, I was talking. Who was I talking to? I was talking to somebody recently who said to me, "Oh yeah, I read that book by Steve Silberman, Neurotribes," and they weren't aware that he passed away last year. So we talked a little bit about that, and I'm happy to openly say that, for me, Steve was he was a friend, but he was a good ally. He wasn't always perfect by any stretch. No one ever is, but he was a good ally of the neurodivergent population, the autistic population in particular. Neurotribes had quite an impact, and it really did open a few doors for a lot of later writers, I think. More of that, more neurotypical people who are happy to get stuck in, especially if they hold positions of power. That's what you want. You want an ally who's in middle or senior management, who's going to be heard and listened to. So, cast your net wide, see who you can get.
Yeah, absolutely. Good advice. Thank you. Comment here that I think I hear so much, not just within employment, but at kind of in childhood and in, you know, in any situation where an autistic person is trying to secure support and adaptation so that they can thrive. And that is, somebody here has said, I'm a late diagnosed autistic and I work as a nurse specialist in chronic pain. And I see a lot of autistic patients who struggle with work. A common phrase I hear is that I'm too functional to be considered disabled, and I'm too disabled to be functional. And it's the invisibility of people's struggles, and that's the hardest thing. So again, you know, that we hear that a lot in education as well, don't we? It's like, well, you're too disabled for this, but you're not disabled enough for that. We hear that a lot in social care, and you know, and again, it's coming up in work. I just wanted your thoughts on that, really. So it's clearly not a question, but I'm just really interested in what you think about that idea and what advice you might have for anyone out there who's being leveled with that same kind of criticism, that they're not enough of one or another in order to be able to tick the boxes.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of aspects to it, isn't there? There's the kind of official side of this, where it's about actual literal forms and things being ticked off, and you know, things like access to work and that kind of thing. And yeah, for that, it can be very, very difficult. I think what you need to do in terms of those formal set kind of structures is you have to be really very, very brutally honest about exactly where your challenges lie. I did an access to work thing myself about a year ago now. It didn't really come to anything because the things they offered were so pitiful, but I did at least go through it. And I found myself, and I'd spoken about this with somebody beforehand, I found myself going into people-pleasing, fawning mode, because I was talking to an official person, you know, a person of authority, which is a bit of a trigger for me. I don't enjoy that. I find that very difficult. And I found myself slipping into yes man mode, which of course is the last thing you want to do. Because basically, you know, it's like I often make the joke about how I went into the doctor's once. I got the appointment because, and I quote, my depression is so severe, I am worried, I'm scared for my own safety, right? That's where I was at that stage. This was about 6 or 7 years ago. And then I went into the doctor's surgery and was like, hi. And they said, oh, how are you doing, Mr. Wharmby? And I was like, oh, I'm fine, thank you. You know, yeah, I'm fine. Because I slipped into my script, into my let's not upset the neurotypicals script. You know, my kind of misfiring small talk script. And it very nearly made things, you know, it really didn't do me any good, because if that's what the doctor sees, that's what the doctor sees. You know, they can't look it literally in my head. So I had to really force myself out of this habit of doing that, and force myself to be more, for want of a better word, honest about what I actually did find difficult. And this can be another good aspect to that I mentioned about knowing yourself, you know, like profiling yourself, figuring out your own autisticness. Well, what is it that you find difficult? Like, honestly, genuinely, what is hard for you? Like for me, for example, I find it enormously difficult to start tasks. I find it even more difficult to switch tasks. I find it incredibly difficult to start anything which is complex, because I don't know where to start and I don't know how to get going. I find organization to be almost impossible to achieve, and this leads to me losing money and paying fines and all kinds of things. You know, these are serious things. And I went to my access to work person with a list of this stuff that I really found too difficult. And that did actually work. It got me through to the next stage. It didn't ultimately lead to much, but it did get me heard. And so yeah, on a formal level, when it comes to governments and things like that, then I think it really is important to be warts and all, even if you've been conditioned never to do that. So many autistic people are conditioned from birth almost to be very stoic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're told to shut up, we're told to stop complaining, we're told to just take it when we're uncomfortable. You know, we're told, well, it's not hot in here at all. What are you talking about? You know, so we learn over years and years that we're not allowed to complain. We're not allowed to tell the truth even about our own feelings. So then when the time comes that we actually desperately need to, we're not equipped for that because we've been conditioned out of it. So it's important, I think, to recognize that about ourselves and to think, I really need to somehow regain that ability, you know? And if that involves including somebody, like having an advocate with you, a loved one, a friend who can help. I mean, I often use that for doctor's appointments these days because of that, you know, thing that, you know, when I was, you know, hi, that can be beneficial. But yes, in a more informal sense, you know, that feeling of neither here nor there, I think a big part of it might boil down to that problem of the whole high functioning, low functioning, you know, vocabulary, which is just so irritatingly hopeless. You know, really rebuild that idea of yourself as, you know, you might be low support needs. I would say that I'm low support needs most of the time, but not all of the time. And I'm honest with that to people now. You know, I'm open about that with people, and I tell people, you know, often overshare, of course, because that's what I do. And that makes those conversations actually much easier then, because that's where I'm coming from. You know, hey, yeah, I'm generally low support needs, but I will need support sometimes, especially when I'm stressed, especially, you know, in tricky times or whatever.
Yeah. Thank you. Really interesting question here, given the Wellbeing Hub's focus on children and young people. And that is, what's the biggest piece of advice you would give to your younger self about trying to become employed?
I've got two. I've got a fairly jokey one, and then I've got a more real one, although the jokey one is still real. In a very short, the very silly short form answer is, when job adverts say must have 3 years experience, they don't mean that. Okay? How many of us have not applied for a job because we didn't meet that requirement? And yet, apparently, they are movable on that. You know, and for me, that in a nutshell is the difference between neurotypical and neurodivergent. You know, just that unspoken rule or that unspoken truth that we're not privy to. And when I found that out, I was in my late 20s and I was annoyed. It really, really annoyed me. I think it was because it was the first time I was involved in recruitment as a teacher. I was second in department, so I was involved in recruiting new English teachers into the department. And I remember somebody had only had a certain amount of experience with a certain year group or something like that, which would not, you know, I thought was pretty much cut and dried. You need to have taught sixth form, I think it was. You know, you have to have had at least 1 year experience with sixth form, and they hadn't had that. And, you know, the head teacher and that were like, well, you know, their CV's good otherwise. Should we just give them a try? And I was like, what? What the hell? You can't what? But you said. You know, the number of people that won't have applied because of that. What the hell are you doing? I was furious. Still am, weirdly. So yeah, that would be one of them. Don't take that necessarily as being, you know, hard and fast as it seems to be. The second one would be don't undervalue your peace of mind. I think when you're in a job, especially one of those jobs that you get when you're young, you know, one of the kind of entry level jobs that you might get straight out of school, or even while you're still at school, or when you're at university, or whatever it might be. And you might get that gut feeling of, I really don't like it here. This is not a good fit for me. I think an encouragement to take that seriously, listen to that, is something that I wish somebody had actually said to me, because I put myself through hell several times because I didn't listen to my own, you know, alarm bells ringing about the unsuitability of it. And of course, I didn't even know I was autistic. All I knew was there was something about this space that really, really didn't work for me at all. But I squashed it down and I stuck it out, and that was not a good idea. I should have listened to my own, you know, gut feeling there, I think. So yeah, I would say that it's a bit of a negative one, really, but it's just something that's so strong in my memory. So I just, you know, I think that is a big one. Again, it's related, I think, to that tendency that we have as autistic adults or old, you know, young adults, to squash down our misgivings and our doubts because we've been conditioned to ignore them by neurotypical parents, peers, teachers, etc. So no, don't ignore them. Listen to them.
Yeah. No, that's really good advice, and it kind of connects to the advice that you gave us in your last talk, that you gave to us on sensory comfort, which I think is still on our YouTube channel for those of you interested. And that was, kind of having that belief in oneself, and kind of, really kind of connecting to one's own experience of the world. And on the flip side of that, you've also suggested that the most important thing for non-autistic people to do is to believe autistic people when they talk about their experiences. So those two things obviously go hand in hand. And I think that also connects very strongly to the things that you've been talking about tonight. And certainly some of the things that are coming up in the chat about people who have very justified anxiety around talking to their employers. In fact, we've had one comment here tonight from somebody who said that they've been told by someone that they're fed up of hearing autism. It's that there is, I think in some organizations there may be that kind of level of fatigue around adjustments that people might need, and I think that's also something that that this particular person has pointed on or touched on, that I think is really prevalent too.
Yeah. It's the guaranteed kickback, isn't it? I mean, we've seen it in the media more broadly over the last year, haven't we? The autistic community, the neurodivergent community more broadly. Just when it felt like things were starting to improve, all of a sudden the book charts were filled with books attacking neurodiversity. The news was filled with stories, it's all overdiagnosed. It's all, it's the kickback. It always happens. Whenever you try to make any progress, there's always some kind of push back in the other direction. It just sucks when you're the individual experiencing it at an individual level.
Absolutely.
It's one thing on a societal level, it's a whole other thing on a personal level. And that fatigue that some people, here we go, autism. Again, I mean, I was trying to build bridges. I can see where people would come from. This thing has, as far as they're concerned, kind of come out of nowhere. I mean, it hasn't really, but as far as they're concerned, it has. And everyone's now, talking about it. People are, blaming things on the fact they're autistic. I can see where they're coming from. It's all ignorant, of course. It's obvious where they're coming from. It's obvious what their thought process is. What we need to do, not necessarily you in the workplace, you haven't got the energy or the ability to, but what we as a society need to do is try to intercept that thought process as it happens and try to get it back on a better track, by whatever means we have, like even just something little, like I often might start with, I know that you've heard a lot about this recently. I know it's all over, but here's some information that will be useful to you. It's that kind of just catching the runaway mind train before it goes too far in that bad direction and getting things back on track. Because it's natural, it's human nature. We get fatigued, we get fed up of hearing of the same thing all the time. It is what it is, really. We just need to know how to combat it.
Yeah. Well, my final question to you, Pete, as we're kind of rapidly approaching 8:30. First of all, I want to thank everybody who's made a comment and a suggestion and shared their experiences in the chat tonight. Pete, if you get the time afterwards, I'm sure that'll be interesting reading for you. Lots of love for you in the chat as well, Pete, as always. But I always end the webinars with the same question of our speakers, and that is, if there was just one thing you would like us to take away from the things you've said tonight, what would that be?
Don't do it all alone. I think that's probably the general theme that's come through today, I think, more than anything. If you're an autistic person struggling at work or trying to get heard at work, maybe even trying to get things moving at work, trying to make real change or just trying to survive, don't try and do it all by yourself. Try and buddy up with some other struggling neurodivergents, or find an ally, find a mentor, find a friendly senior person. Just find people, maybe not people you live with, maybe not your spouse or your partner, because you don't necessarily want to, that can be tricky. I think that can make things harder. But somebody in the workplace, somebody who knows it, somebody who's there, somebody who's on the ground with you, who you can trust and who can help you through, and go to meetings with you, organize pride events with you. Just find people, find other people. Don't be isolated, I think.
That's great advice, Pete. Thanks so much. And thank you again for coming back to share your expertise and your experience with us. It's so much appreciated. Thank you very much, everyone. It is 8:30, so we're going to close tonight's webinar. Thank you so much to everyone who's attended, and thank you also to those who are watching after tonight on our YouTube channel. And yeah, just a reminder that there is a link in the chat to John Adams' talk, which is our July webinar. He's just amazing. If you haven't had a chance to hear from John, please sign up for that. And again, even if you can't attend, sign up, because you'll get a link to the recording just like you will for Pete's talk tonight. Yeah, and if you need any more information about anything that we're doing, then just email autism@reading.ac.uk and we can give you the information. Thanks, everyone. Take care, keep cool, and I'll see you next month. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
There we are.